Hey there, Drowsy Historian here. Tonight's story doesn't involve gallows, inquisitions, or the sort of naval disaster where half the crew is eaten by the other half. No, tonight we turn to something colder, slower, and arguably just as fatal, a colonial winter. This is the tale of how early settlers, wearing wool that never truly dried and boots that leaked at the first hint of slush, attempted to outlast months of freezing darkness. We'll travel from drafty timber houses to cellars that smelled faintly of turnips, from smoke-choked kitchens to church services, held in air so cold the ink froze in the minister's pen. Because before anyone could dream of the first green shoots of spring, they first had to survive the long, gnawing stretch of winter without starving, freezing, or throttling their nearest relation. Before we begin this slow walk through the frost-bitten corridors of early colonial life, do me one small favour. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. If you'd prefer these stories without ads, you can join the Patreon. It's linked in the description. And if you're the sort who needs more than whispered misery to drift off, consider using a white noise machine. They're great for drowning out the noise of the external world while you drift off to sleep. I've linked my favourite one in the description below. Now, lie back, get comfortable, let's begin. If you were a colonial householder in early America, the arrival of September would be less a change in the weather than the sudden ringing of a bell that meant you were already behind. The air might still hold a hint of summer warmth, but you knew better than to trust it. Somewhere beyond the tree line, frost was rehearsing its lines. These were the months when every waking hour was devoted to a single goal, ensuring there would be enough of everything to carry you through until spring. That meant enough food, enough fuel, enough clothing, enough fodder for the livestock, and enough nerve to face the fact that you would almost certainly run short of at least one of them. The first priority was preserving whatever the summer and early autumn had provided. Vegetables that had grown plump under the August sun were suddenly a ticking clock, their ripeness a liability. Beans and peas were strung up to dry, rows of them dangling from rafters, like a kind of crude bunting. Cabbages were pulled from the garden and packed into barrels with layers of salt, transforming over time into something that could be called sauerkraut if you were feeling generous. Root vegetables, turnips, carrots, parsnips were brushed free of soil and stacked in cellars, each one inspected for blemishes, since a single rot spot could spread like gossip through the entire store. Pumpkins and squash were set aside, their tough skins a natural seal against decay, though by March you might not care to see another slice of either. Meat required more deliberate attention. If you were fortunate enough to own livestock, autumn meant the annual culling. Animals that would not make it through the winter on stored feed were slaughtered, while the weather was still cool enough to slow spoilage. The meat was salted heavily, packed into barrels, or smoked over slow-burning fires until it was as tough as leather and nearly as flavourless. Fresh pork or beef in January would be as rare as a fresh peach and considerably more valuable. Hunting added variety, though not without risk. The same woods that might yield deer also held the possibility of injury, getting lost, or encountering predators less fussy than you about the condition of their dinner. Grain was the backbone of survival, and the harvest was a nervous affair. Wheat, rye, barley, and maize all had to be cut, threshed, winnowed, and stored in a dry place, safe from damp and vermin. Any moisture in the grain could lead to mould, which would render it useless, or worse, dangerous. Granaries were checked and patched, cracks sealed against the intrusion of mice, whose winter appetites were every bit as determined as your own. Corn especially required attention. Ears were husked and kernels dried on racks or strung in garlands, the golden rows a temporary splash of colour before they were ground into meal. Flour was precious and prone to spoiling, and the first time you found weevils crawling through a barrel, you understood why so many settlers developed a talent for not looking too closely at their bread. Fuel, however, was the preparation that consumed the most muscle and the most time. Colonial heating did not come from turning a knob. It came from cutting down trees, splitting them into manageable lengths, and stacking them in neat rows to season before the cold set in. A single household could burn through multiple cords of wood over the course of a winter, and each cord represented days of labour. The work was relentless and dangerously easy to postpone in favour of more immediately visible chores, but the penalty for neglect was waking to a dead hearth and a cold that could make your teeth ache before you had even opened your mouth. The irony, of course, was that you warmed yourself twice with every log, once in the chopping and once in the burning, though that was a sentiment most often repeated by people who weren't the ones swinging the axe. Alongside the big tasks ran a constant current of smaller, fiddlier ones. Tools had to be repaired before snow made the workbench uninviting. Leaky roofs were patched with whatever materials came to hand. Shingles if you had them, shakes if you could split them, or even sod in the most desperate cases. Window frames were checked for drafts and stuffed with rags, moss, or whatever else could be persuaded to stay in place. Clay and lime were daubed into gaps between logs, a process that never truly seemed finished because the house itself shifted with the seasons. Clothing was another quiet form of preparation. Wool spun and woven through the summer was cut and sewn into garments that, if not exactly stylish, at least covered what needed covering. Mittens were knitted, stockings darned, and cloaks mended, though in the end, nothing you wore could entirely defeat the cold. Preservation extended beyond the pantry to the very air you breathed indoors. Smokehouses and drying racks perfumed the autumn air with a mingling of wood smoke, curing meat, and drying herbs. Sage, thyme, and rosemary were bundled and hung in the rafters, both for cooking and for the vague medicinal comfort they were thought to provide. Apples were sliced and strung to dry, their scent almost enough to disguise the underlying odour of damp wool and livestock that clung to every enclosed space. Honey, if you had hives, was collected and stored, doubling as sweetener and antiseptic. Even the humblest household had a mental inventory of what lay in each jar, barrel, and sack, and what could be traded with neighbours for something different. None of this resembled the romantic vision of an autumn larder groaning under the weight of plenty. The colonial pantry was not abundance, it was calculation. You did not admire it so much as measure it, counting the jars and barrels, and weighing the likelihood of them lasting until the first green shoots appeared. A shelf of salted meat did not invite feasting. It silently asked how many days it could be stretched. A barrel of apples was a brief luxury that would dwindle by February into a handful of shriveled, brown-hearted survivors. Each row of jars and sacks was a wager against the length and severity of the coming winter, and the odds were not always in your favour. This period of preparation also dictated the social rhythm of the settlement. Neighbours might help one another with larger tasks, raising a barn before the frost, cutting and stacking a particularly large woodlot, or sharing the labour of slaughtering livestock. In return, they would expect the same help when their turn came. Such cooperation was not born of generosity alone. Isolation in winter was dangerous, and a household that failed to prepare could become a burden on its neighbours. Helping someone else now was a way of insuring yourself against their desperate knock at your door in January. As the days shortened and the air cooled, there was a quiet shift in mood. The urgency of the work sharpened, because everyone knew there would come a day when the first frost would make certain tasks far more difficult, and a day after that when they would be impossible. The land itself seemed to hurry you along, the trees shedding leaves faster than you could rake them, the sun retreating earlier each evening, as if it had its own warm place to be. By the end of October, the barns and cellars would be full to whatever extent your labour allowed, the woodpile hopefully high, the tools in order, and the last of the garden cleared. You might pause then, not to rest but to take stock, to run the mental tally once more and decide whether it was enough. It was never quite enough. Every seasoned settler knew that. Winter was not a polite dinner guest who announced its arrival and kept to its allotted time. It could arrive early, stay late, or return for an encore after you thought it had gone. All you could do was prepare as though it might be the longest and coldest you had ever faced, and accept that the season ahead would test your stores, your strength, and your patience. The final days before the first snowfall held a peculiar stillness, as if the land itself were holding its breath. And then one morning, you would wake to find the world muffled and white, and the long months of living on the results of your frantic autumn had begun. By the time the last barrel was sealed, the final cords of wood stacked, and the garden reduced to bare earth, the focus shifted from what you had to how you would keep it. All the food in the world would do little good if frost turned your home into a walk-in larder, and all the firewood you'd laboured over would vanish in weeks if the heat simply bled through the walls. Autumn's frenzy of gathering and storing gave way to another kind of work, quieter but just as vital. The work of turning a draughty box of boards into a place where human beings could endure the cold. Your house was the only thing between you and the cold, and yet it was itself a cold thing, built in a hurry, from green wood or rough logs, often by hands that had more enthusiasm than skill. There was no such thing as airtight construction. On a bright morning you might look up from the table and see daylight winking through the seams in the walls. In summer, this was tolerable. In winter, it was an invitation for the wind to come in and take up residence, and still, you were grateful for it, because it was more than some had, and because you knew exactly what life was like without even those thin walls. The first step in turning that draughty box into something that could sustain life was closing the gaps. This was done through a process called chinking and daubing, which was as inelegant as it sounded. Strips of wood or stone were wedged into the spaces between logs, then sealed over with a mixture of clay, mud, straw, and sometimes lime. Over time, the daubing would crack or crumble, leaving gaps that had to be patched again. It was a constant battle against both weather and pests, for mice and insects took a lively interest in any material that promised warmth or food. In more prosperous homes, especially in towns, the exterior might be clad in clapboard to hide these crude seams, but even that could warp and split. You learned to keep an eye out for trouble spots because a small hole in October could turn into an icy draft in January. Windows, if you had them, were a mixed blessing. Glass was expensive and often arrived in small panes set in wooden frames, held together with lead or putty that hardened and cracked in the cold. A few households, especially in the earliest settlements, did without glass entirely, covering openings with oiled paper that let in a dull, filtered light while blocking the worst of the wind. In winter, these fragile barriers were supplemented with animal hides or thick cloth hung over the inside of the frame, plunged into semi-darkness to keep the warmth in. Curtains served less for privacy than for insulation, and they were drawn not at nightfall, but whenever the temperature dropped. It was not uncommon to wake in the morning to find frost patterns blooming across the inside of the glass. Delicate and beautiful, until you remembered they were forming because your breath was freezing on contact. The door was another point of weakness. Hinges loosened, frames warped, and no matter how carefully it was fitted, a thin line of light often showed along the bottom where the wind crept in. To fight this, settlers used draft stoppers, lengths of cloth stuffed with straw or rags, pressed against the threshold. Some even hung heavy blankets or quilts on the inside of the door, creating a sort of second barrier. Locks were less a concern than latches. The real intruder in winter was not a thief, but the air itself. The same was true for chimneys, which needed to draw well enough to keep smoke from spilling into the room, yet not so powerfully that they pulled all the warm air out with it. A poorly designed flue could mean constant smoke and watery eyes, but an open hearth without a chimney was even worse, filling the house with a haze that clung to your clothing and hair until spring. Inside, the arrangement of space became a strategy for survival. The kitchen with its hearth was the warmest room in the house, and thus became the centre of winter life. Cooking fires burned almost continuously, not simply for meals, but because letting the fire die meant starting it again from cold, a task made more difficult by damp wood and numb fingers. Families gravitated to this space, working, eating, and sometimes sleeping within its radius of heat. The further you moved from the hearth, the colder the air became, until upstairs bedrooms or back rooms felt like separate climates entirely. On bitter nights, the family might sleep in shifts near the fire, or children might be bundled together in one bed, their combined body heat the only source of warmth. Furnishings were arranged with this in mind. Chairs were pulled close to the hearth, work tables positioned to catch the light and warmth, and storage placed along the outer walls to serve as a sort of crude insulation. Heavy chests, barrels, and cupboards acted as windbreaks against the cold seeping through the timber. Even beds were sometimes boxed in with curtains or wooden frames, creating small warm pockets of air that could be heated by a single body. It was a practical form of luxury. You could climb in at night, pull the curtains shut, and for a few hours pretend the entire room was as warm as this narrow, enclosed space. Flooring offered another challenge. Many early houses had only packed earth floors, which in winter became a cold sink for every ounce of heat in the room. Rushes or straw might be spread over them, replaced periodically when they grew dirty or damp. In more finished homes, wooden floors were still unsealed and full of gaps, and rugs or woven mats were laid down, more to block drafts than to decorate. Stockings were worn indoors, not out of propriety, but necessity, as walking barefoot on the floor was an invitation to misery. Even the family cat, if you had one, learned to find the warmest patch and stay there for hours, no matter how inconveniently it blocked the way. The constant struggle was not to achieve perfect warmth. Such a thing was beyond the reach of even the wealthiest colonial household, but to slow the escape of heat long enough to make life bearable. Every decision, from where to hang a drying rack to how high to stack the woodpile near the hearth, was made with this in mind. The kitchen fire was both the literal and social heart of the home. Here, cooking mingled with mending, storytelling, and the quiet, repetitive work that could be done without leaving the heat's reach. It was where you dried your boots, thawed your fingers, and occasionally allowed yourself to believe that winter was something you could endure without complaint. Yet the fire was also a constant demand. Wood had to be brought in, ashes carried out, and the balance between heat and safety maintained. An overstocked hearth could throw sparks into the room, setting fire to rugs, clothes, or worse. Chimneys needed to be cleared of creosote to prevent chimney fires, a dangerous and all too common winter hazard. Smoke from green or wet wood could choke a room and leave everyone with streaming eyes and raw throats. You learned to read the fire the way some people read the sky, its colour, its sound, the way the smoke curled, because in winter your life was bound to its temper. The irony was that even with all this effort, your house never truly became a refuge from the cold. You learned to live in layers, to work with your hands while your breath smoked in the air. Frost might creep across the inside of walls and ice might form in the water bucket overnight, despite its proximity to the hearth. You might wake in the morning to find your hair damp and stiff from your own breath, freezing while you slept. These were not failures of preparation, but simply the limits of what timber, mud, and wool could accomplish against a North American winter. Still, the house mattered. It kept out the worst of the wind, gave you a place to store what food and fuel you had, and provided a space where human company could knit together against the cold. Its imperfections were familiar, even oddly reassuring. You knew exactly which floorboard would complain underfoot, where the draft came in strongest, and how to position yourself at the table so that you felt the heat of the fire without catching the smoke. In this way, the house was less a fortress against winter than a trusted companion in the siege, flawed, drafty, and stubbornly standing between you and the long, hard months ahead. A warm fire was the prize, but the woodpile was the currency that bought it. And in midwinter, you spent it every day. By the time snow had settled in for good, the pile you'd stacked in autumn was no longer a monument to preparedness. It was a dwindling account you checked anxiously, aware that the balance would only go one way until spring. The work of cutting and stacking might have been behind you for the moment, but the labour was far from over. Fuel still had to be managed, protected, and carried indoors in the quantities that kept the hearth going without depleting your reserves too quickly. Winter turned the woodpile into a barometer of your household's fortunes. A tall, neat stack suggested security, while a low, dishevelled one was a silent admission that you might soon be burning whatever you could find. Driftwood, scrap timber, even dried corn cobs, just to keep the chill from settling into your bones. Each trip to the pile became a small act of accounting. You'd glance over the rows, note how much had gone since the last visit, and weigh the day's cold against your willingness to see the pile shrink. The weather dictated your usage as much as your caution did. On days when the cold was merely sharp, the fire might be kept modest, its flames banked low, so the room was habitable rather than comfortable. But when the wind howled and ice thickened on the inside of the windows, the hearth roared, the wood vanished, and you told yourself you'd make it up on some gentler day. Mild spells were the time to practice frugality, more layers of clothing, work done closer to the hearth, and acceptance that not every room needed to be heated. Snow complicated even the simplest refueling. A heavy storm could bury the pile completely, forcing you to dig a narrow trench to it, stamping down the sides so they wouldn't collapse on the next trip. Logs frozen together had to be prized apart, their surfaces knocked free of ice before being hauled inside. It was work that soaked gloves and stiffened boots, leaving your hands raw even before you'd carried the arm load back to the fire. On the worst days, the trek to the woodpile felt like a small expedition, the wind finding every gap in your clothing while your breath hung in the air like smoke. Inside, the fire needed as much tending as the woodpile. Green or damp logs could smother it, producing thick smoke that curled back into the room, coating everything with a fine layer of soot. Too much ash in the hearth could choke the embers, while too little could mean losing them entirely overnight. Most households banked the fire at day's end, raking the embers together and covering them with ash to hold the heat until morning. A good bed of coals meant the day could begin with the reassurance of flame, rather than the cold misery of coaxing fire from spark. Wood choice mattered even now. The dense hardwoods that burned long and hot were prized for the coldest days, while softer woods, like pine or spruce, were reserved for quick bursts of heat or for kindling. In cooking, certain woods were preferred for the flavour they lent to whatever simmered in the pot, apple or maple being particularly valued. But such preferences were luxuries. Most of the time, the decision came down to what was seasoned enough to burn and what could be reached without risk of frostbite. The placement of the woodpile itself was a kind of domestic strategy. Too far from the house, and every trip was a punishment. Too close, and it risked attracting pests or becoming an eyesore in the one view you had from your windows. Many families kept a smaller indoor store, a rack or stack by the hearth, to reduce trips outside during bad weather. This inner pile was rotated constantly, with fresh logs brought in daily, so they had time to dry and shed any remaining frost before being fed to the fire. The wood pile was also a quiet measure of a household's discipline. In some homes its reduction was carefully paced, each log accounted for, in the mind of whoever was charged with tending the fire. In others it dwindled alarmingly fast, the result of over-generous burning or poor rationing. This could spark arguments, subtle at first then sharper, about whether too much was being used, whether someone had forgotten to bank the fire, or whether children were being careless when tasked with fetching logs. In a winter that looked to be turning long, such disputes could gnaw at morale as persistently as the cold itself. Even the act of carrying wood indoors became part of the day's rhythm. It was work that warmed you briefly in its doing, your muscles heating under the weight, only for the chill to return as soon as you stopped. The smell of fresh split wood mingled with the smoke inside, clinging to clothing and hair until it was impossible to tell where the scent of the house ended and that of the wood began. The pile outside diminished in silence, but the fire inside answered with its steady, consuming crackle. There was a certain pride in maintaining a generous store deep into the season, a visible sign of foresight and labour. Visitors would notice it, remark on it, and in some cases quietly envy it. Conversely, a sparse or disordered pile could invite pity or, worse, speculation about your competence. In isolated settlements, your preparedness, or lack thereof, became part of your unspoken reputation. Wood was survival, but it was also a form of social currency, proof that you could manage the demands of the land and the season. And yet, for all the watchfulness and restraint, the truth remained that every log burned was one you would never see again. The warmth it provided was immediate and fleeting, gone in hours, leaving behind only a heap of ash to be swept up. It was a cycle that repeated itself countless times between the first frost and the final thaw. Each fire, a small victory paid for in advance with hours of labour. You learned to take satisfaction where you could, in the feel of heat on your face, the sight of the room glowing with firelight, the way the cold seemed to retreat, even briefly, from the corners of the house. By the time you'd made peace with the size of the wood pile and the pace of its consumption, your thoughts often turned to the other line of defence between yourself and the cold, whatever you happened to be wearing. Fires warmed rooms, but only in patches, and the reality of colonial life was that most of the day was spent in places where the air still bit at your skin. If the hearth was the heart of winter survival, clothing was the armour, and everyone wore theirs until it sagged with fatigue. There was no daily rotation of outfits for variety's sake. Garments were chosen for endurance, patched until they barely held together, and worn in the same combination for months at a stretch. The basic winter wardrobe was a layered affair, but layering only did so much when the materials were limited. Wool was the most common choice for warmth, woven into everything from heavy cloaks to stockings, but it was never entirely comfortable. A thick woolen garment held heat well, but it also trapped damp and sweat, and once it was wet, it took an age to dry. Under the wool came linen shirts or shifts, worn year-round, their texture softened by years of washing and wear. Over it all, if you were fortunate, you might have an outer layer of fur or sheepskin, though these were often reserved for the wealthier or for those living where the cold was particularly merciless. Boots and shoes were rarely the sturdy, waterproof kind modern minds imagine. Most were made of leather, which stiffened in the cold and absorbed moisture like a sponge. In snowy or muddy weather, you might wrap your feet in layers of wool or even stuff them with dried grass or fur for insulation, an arrangement that was better than nothing, but far from comfortable. A long day outside could leave your stockings wet through, and they would often remain that way for days if you lacked a dry spare. The universal colonial smell of wet wool was as much a part of winter as the sound of the wind at the windows. It clung to clothing, bedding, and hair, impossible to banish until the air warmed and everything could be aired out under the sun. Head coverings were essential, not only for warmth but for preserving what little comfort you could carry. Men wore knitted caps, felt hats, or fur-lined hoods, while women wrapped themselves in kerchiefs, caps, or shawls that could be pulled over the ears. Scarves were less common in the modern sense, but lengths of cloth served the same purpose, wrapped tightly to seal the gap between collar and chin. Mittens were preferred over gloves for their ability to trap heat between the fingers, and they were often lined with scraps of fur if you had the means. Children's mittens were sometimes strung together, on a cord threaded through the sleeves of a coat, to prevent them from being lost, a small mercy for parents who had no resources to replace them midwinter. Despite all these layers, the cold had a way of seeping in, finding the smallest weakness in your defences. Sitting still for too long let the chill settle into your bones, no matter how many garments you piled on. Work helped, but only for as long as your muscles kept moving. Once you stopped, the sweat in your clothes turned against you, cooling rapidly and leaching away the heat you'd earned. There was an irony in the fact that many people spent their winters alternately overheating during hard labour and shivering during rest. Caught in a cycle, their clothing could never quite balance. Washing clothes in winter was an ordeal often postponed until the season broke, which meant wearing the same garments day after day, week after week. Underlayers might be changed more frequently if you had spares, but outer layers were rarely laundered. Wool was heavy when wet and difficult to dry without risking mildew, so most coats and cloaks were simply brushed clean of surface dirt and hung by the fire to drive out damp. The resulting combination of stale sweat, smoke, and the faint, earthy scent of animal fibres was simply accepted as the smell of winter. Children often fared the worst in this arrangement. They outgrew clothing quickly, and many families could not afford to replace winter garments every year. Instead, younger children wore the handed-down coats, mittens, and stockings of their elders, sometimes visibly too large, sometimes worn nearly to rags. It was not unusual for a child to spend the entire winter in one outfit, sleeping in it at night to save on blankets, and wearing it again in the morning with barely a shake. Comfort was sacrificed for necessity, and any protest about fit or itchiness was met with reminders that the garment in question was all that stood between them and frostbite. Repair was constant. Stockings were darned until they became more patch than original wool, knees were reinforced with squares of cloth, and worn cuffs were turned or trimmed to eke out another season's use. The ability to mend was as valuable as the ability to make new garments, and many evenings were spent by the fire with needle and thread, the work lit by the same flames that dried the fabric. In households where multiple generations lived together, elders often took on this work, their failing eyesight and slower pace better suited to stitching than to outdoor chores. In especially harsh winters, even the best prepared families might supplement their wardrobes with improvised measures. Blankets were cut down into wraps or cloaks. Sacks were lined with scraps of cloth and used as makeshift overshoes, and every scrap of fur, leather or wool was pressed into service. There was no room for sentimentality over worn or damaged garments. If a coat could be cut into mittens, or an old cloak could be refashioned into smaller pieces, it was done without hesitation. Every layer counted, and if it meant walking to the woodpile with a blanket pinned over your shoulders, so be it. The concept of fashion did not disappear entirely in winter, but it bent to the dictates of the cold. Those in towns or wealthier households might still concern themselves with colour, trim, and the cut of a coat, but even these were subject to the demands of insulation. Fine fabrics were layered over plainer ones. Decorative buttons were sewn onto garments that were otherwise practical, and lace or embroidery was sometimes added simply to distract from the fact that the garment beneath was worn thin. For most, however, the only aesthetic consideration was whether the garment could last until the thaw. Cold weather also created a subtle hierarchy of visibility. Those who had enough clothing to change more frequently, who could keep a set dry while another was worn, looked markedly more comfortable and better kept than those who wore the same damp garments day after day. Visitors noticed these things, and in a community where reputation was survival, appearing well prepared could be as important as actually being so. Clothing spoke as loudly as the size of your woodpile or the state of your pantry. Still, no matter how carefully you layered, no matter how well you repaired and patched, there was a limit to what colonial clothing could achieve. Wool could hold in heat, but it could not stop the wind from finding its way through seams. Leather might keep your feet dry for a time, but it cracked in the cold and leaked at the first deep snow. Linen was comfortable against the skin, but it offered little defence against freezing air. Winter in the colonies was less a matter of keeping warm than of keeping the cold at bay for as long as possible each day. Layers of wool and leather might have kept the worst of the wind off your skin, but warmth alone could not carry a household through the long middle stretch of winter. Beneath the comfort of the hearth and the burden of clothing lay another daily calculation: what there was to eat and how long it might last. By February, the optimism of autumn's full cellars was long gone. Shelves that had once been crowded with jars and barrels now showed bare wood between their ranks, and the decisions made months earlier about what to preserve, trade, or consume fresh were playing out with inescapable clarity. The cold months tested not just the body's endurance, but its willingness to meet the same meals day after day without complaint. The backbone of a colonial winter diet was whatever had been most practical to preserve. Salted meat was a constant. Pork, beef, or fish packed in brine so strong it could sting the tongue. Before it could be cooked, it had to be soaked in several changes of water to draw out some of the salt, a process that consumed both time and fuel. Even then, the flavour clung, turning stews and soups into brackish affairs that left you thirsty long after the meal. Fresh meat in February was rare unless you were a skilled hunter or had an animal to slaughter, and even then, the kill was often preserved immediately to stretch it further. Game, when it could be had, was a welcome change, though wild meat brought its own strong flavours. Venison could be rich, rabbit delicate, but anything trapped or snared in desperation risked being stringy or lean to the point of toughness. Dried legumes were another staple. Peas, beans, and lentils kept well through the cold months, stored in sacks or barrels, away from damp and pests. They were dependable in a way that fresh vegetables could never be in winter, but their reliability came at the cost of variety. Most were boiled into thick soups or porridge-like stews, sometimes with bits of salt pork for flavour. A pot of peas simmering on the hearth was as much a fixture of winter as the creak of the rafters in the wind, and it filled the belly, if not the imagination. In the absence of spices or herbs, which might have been used up earlier in the season or were too costly to replenish, the taste could become so monotonous that some families swore by adding a dash of vinegar, cider, or even a spoonful of molasses just to change the flavour. Corn, especially in the form of meal, played a central role in sustaining households through the winter. Cornbread, ash cakes and porridge were daily fare, their texture and flavour dictated by the quality of the meal and whatever additions could be spared. Without leavening, cornbread could be dense and heavy, a serviceable but uninspired companion to whatever stew or broth was on the table. When milk or eggs were scarce, substitutions were made with water and fat, yielding bread that filled the stomach but little else. Still, cornmeal's adaptability kept it indispensable. It could be eaten hot, cold, sweetened with a bit of honey when spirits needed lifting, or fried for a rare indulgence. Root vegetables provided the closest thing to freshness in the depths of winter. Carrots, turnips, parsnips, and the occasional beet were dug from their storage pits or cellars, where they had been buried in sand or straw to keep them from freezing. Their flavour by midwinter could be earthy to the point of bitterness, and the texture sometimes veered toward limp or woody. Still, they were valued for their bulk and the small measure of variety they offered. Boiled turnips in particular had a reputation for being both necessary and unpleasant, inspiring an entire catalogue of folk remedies to make them more palatable. Some swore by boiling them with a crust of bread, others with a splash of spirits, and a few claimed that roasting them in the ashes of the hearth gave them a sweetness that boiling could never coax out. Though whether this was true or simply an attempt to justify avoiding the pot was debatable. Dairy products were scarce unless you kept livestock capable of producing through the winter, and even then, milk yields dropped sharply when animals were stressed by cold or poor feed. Butter, if made earlier in the season, might be stored in crocks and covered with brine or packed in salt, but by midwinter, the supply often dwindled to a precious reserve. Cheese lasted longer and was easier to transport, but it too had limits. What remained by February was often hard enough to require soaking or shaving into thin pieces to be edible. Eggs were a luxury, as hens laid less in winter unless kept warm and well fed, a condition most barns could not guarantee. Sweetness was rarer still. Honey, if you had it, was guarded carefully, reserved for the sick, for baking on holidays, or for those moments when morale needed rescuing. Molasses, imported and costly, was used sparingly if it was used at all. Sugar was more likely to be in the possession of wealthier households, or kept for medicinal purposes. For most, winter was a time when the desire for sweet foods went largely unanswered, save for what could be coaxed from apples stored in the cellar. Though by this point in the season, the apples were often soft, spotted, and better suited for cider than for eating raw, meals were not simply about nourishment. They were about maintaining the rhythm of the day and the cohesion of the household. Sitting down together, even to a humble pot of bean stew or a heel of bread with broth, created a shared moment of warmth and normalcy. In smaller settlements, neighbours might gather to share meals, pooling ingredients to create something more varied than they could manage alone. Such gatherings were as much about conversation as they were about food, a way to remind one another that winter had not stripped the settlement of its humanity. But food could also be a source of tension. When supplies ran low faster than expected, decisions had to be made about rationing. The portions of meat in a stew might shrink, or the bread might be cut thinner, and those decisions were not always met with quiet acceptance. In households with children, parents often tried to shield them from the worst of the scarcity, taking smaller portions themselves. The children noticed anyway, if only because hunger had a way of sharpening attention to the size of one's share. Cooking methods reflected both the limitations and the ingenuity of the season. Most winter meals were stews, porridges, or boiled dishes, both because these made the most of limited ingredients and because they could simmer for hours on the hearth, requiring less fuel than baking or roasting. Baking, when it was done, was often planned carefully to coincide with other uses of the oven, ensuring no heat was wasted. Occasionally, frying or toasting provided a welcome change in texture, though the extra fat required was not always available. The repetition of flavours and textures wore on people in subtle ways. A stew might be perfectly filling and nutritious, but after the 20th bowl in as many days, enthusiasm waned. This was where small luxuries made a disproportionate difference. A pinch of dried herbs saved from summer, a preserved lemon slice traded for with a neighbour, or a spoonful of cider stirred into a pot for brightness. These small acts were not simply about taste, they were about reminding everyone at the table that life held more than monotony, even in the heart of winter. There was also the quiet knowledge that winter eating was not about indulgence or even about variety. It was about endurance, consuming enough to keep the body warm and functional until the season passed. Nutritional gaps were accepted as unavoidable. Fresh greens were months away, citrus was a rare and expensive import, and the concept of vitamins was not yet known. People recognised scurvy by its symptoms but did not necessarily connect it to diet, attributing it instead to bad air, poor spirits, or sheer misfortune. By late winter, meals could take on a ceremonial quality, less because of the ingredients than because of the effort they represented. The decision to slaughter an animal, open the last jar of preserved fruit, or bake with the last of the flour was not made lightly. These acts punctuated the sameness of the season, marking holidays, visits from neighbours, or milestones within the household. They reminded everyone that food, however humble, could still be a cause for gathering and for gratitude. Winter eating in the colonies was, at its heart, a daily negotiation between appetite, supply, and endurance. Each meal was both a relief and a reminder of what remained in the pantry. In the depths of February, when the woodpile had shrunk, the cold pressed hard against the walls, and the days still ended in darkness, the contents of the table could lift or sink the spirit of the entire household. And so you ate what there was, made the best of it, and kept your thoughts fixed not on what you wished you had, but on making sure there was enough for tomorrow. A meal might keep the body going, but no table could be set without water. In the depth of winter, that simple fact became a daily obstacle, with streams frozen over, wells iced at the edges, and the nearest unfrozen source often a trudge away. The act of getting water was a chore that consumed both time and energy. In summer, a bucket of water was something you might carry almost absent-mindedly. In February, it was a deliberate mission, one that often required tools as much as it did patience. The effort to bring water into the house was as much a part of winter survival as feeding the fire or portioning out the last of the salt pork. For many households, the first step was dealing with ice. If your water came from a stream or pond, winter meant breaking through a crust that could be inches thick. An axe or iron bar was needed to cut a hole wide enough for a bucket, and even then, the edges had to be kept open or the hole would seal itself again overnight. This work was often done in biting wind, with your feet on treacherous footing and your fingers numbing quickly despite the layers. Wells, though less exposed, were not immune to the cold. The water below might remain liquid, but ice could form at the mouth, requiring chipping and clearing before the bucket could be lowered. Once the water was obtained, it had to be carried, a job that could sap the strength from anyone, especially when the snow was deep or the wind fierce. 2 wooden buckets balanced on a yoke across the shoulders was the most efficient method, but even this could leave your arms aching and your back damp with sweat under your coat. The return journey was a careful shuffle, avoiding spills while the sloshing water inside froze at the surface. By the time you reached the door, your gloves might be stiff with ice from the splashes, and the buckets would be rimmed with frozen crystals. Some households turned to snow as a supplement, gathering clean drifts from open areas to melt over the hearth. This was less romantic than it sounded. Snow was mostly air, and the amount of it needed to yield a useful quantity of water was almost comically large. A pot filled to the brim with snow might melt into little more than a cup or two, and the process consumed valuable heat that could have been used for cooking or warming the room. Still, it was often the most convenient option when travel to the usual source was impossible, and in emergencies, it could mean the difference between thirst and some measure of relief. Water was needed for far more than drinking. Cooking, cleaning utensils, mixing bread dough, brewing, and even certain forms of preservation all required it in steady supply. The kitchen's constant demand meant that someone in the household was always watching the buckets by the hearth, topping them up when they ran low. Letting them run dry was an inconvenience in summer. In winter, it was a blunder that could force someone outside into dangerous conditions at the least welcome moment. Then there was the question of washing, both dishes and bodies. Cleanliness was a relative concept in the colonial winter. Dishwashing was done with hot water when available, but more often with warm water barely above freezing, and always in quantities too small to encourage wastefulness. Plates might be wiped down with a cloth and rinsed quickly, with the expectation that the heat of the hearth or the next meal's cooking would take care of anything stubborn. Utensils were scrubbed in the same basin, and water was reused when possible, particularly if hauling fresh buckets meant a trek through knee-deep snow. Personal bathing was another matter entirely. In warm weather, bathing might be a weekly or even more frequent habit, often done in nearby rivers or using basins of heated water. In winter, however, the frequency dropped sharply, sometimes to the point where a full bath was taken only once every month or two. Heated water was too precious to use in large quantities, and stripping down in a frigid room was not an inviting prospect. Most people settled for what was called a quick wash, hands, face, and perhaps neck and ears, with a cloth dipped in warm water. This was often done in the morning, when the fire was fresh, or before bed, when the kitchen was still holding heat from the evening meal. Clothing absorbed much of the dirt and sweat that might otherwise be washed away, and as such, changing undergarments was often seen as sufficient to maintain health. The smell of bodies, smoke, and damp wool blended into what might be called the colonial winter scent. Not pleasant, but not remarkable enough to draw comment. Soap was a homemade commodity for most, made from animal fat and lye, and its harshness was another deterrent to frequent washing. Hands were washed more often out of necessity, particularly before meals. But even then the water might be only lukewarm, and drying them before they froze was as much a priority as the washing itself. The limits of winter hygiene extended to laundry as well. Washing clothes required large quantities of water, heat to warm it, and a place for garments to dry without freezing. In many homes, this meant laundry was postponed until the weather eased, with only essential items, like undergarments, stockings or cloths, washed regularly. Larger items such as coats, bedding and heavy skirts might go the entire season without a full wash, being aired near the fire instead to drive out dampness and reduce odour. The labour involved in hauling enough water for such tasks was significant, and most households judged the result not worth the effort in the depths of winter. For those who kept livestock, water meant more than human needs. Animals required a steady supply, and frozen troughs or buckets were a constant nuisance. Breaking ice and hauling water for cattle, horses, or pigs was often a daily job. made worse by the fact that animals seemed to take no notice of the effort involved and could spill or soil the water almost immediately. For poultry, melted snow or ice might be provided in small amounts, often several times a day, to prevent it from freezing solid before it could be drunk. In settlements or towns, water might be shared from communal wells, which had the advantage of centralising the labour, but also the disadvantage of requiring everyone to make the trip. This sometimes meant waiting in line in the cold, buckets at your feet, as others ahead of you lowered and raised the well's rope and pulley. The coldest days could see a kind of unspoken competition to work quickly, not from impatience but from the mutual understanding that no one wanted to linger in the wind any longer than necessary. The colonial definition of clean in winter was shaped by these limitations. It was less about removing all dirt and more about controlling it, keeping hands and cooking implements reasonably hygienic, ensuring that food and water remained safe to consume, and preventing illness that could spread through the household. There was an acceptance that some grime was inevitable and that the pursuit of absolute cleanliness would come at too high a cost in labour, fuel and warmth. In this way, cleanliness became another balancing act, like rationing food or fuel, measured against the resources available and the demands of survival. Those who look back on the colonial period sometimes imagine a world of rustic simplicity, with clear streams running year-round and snow melting into pristine drinking water at will. The reality was far more laborious. Every drop in winter was either hauled, chopped free from ice, or melted at the expense of heat that might otherwise have gone into cooking or warming the room. It was a constant, unglamorous effort, woven so deeply into daily life that it rarely merited more than a passing comment from those who lived it. Yet without it, no household could last a week, no matter how well stocked the pantry or how high the wood pile. Keeping water clean and available was one battle. Keeping the people who drank it healthy was another. In winter, health was as fragile as thin ice, and illness had a way of slipping into a household, no matter how much you tried to bar the door. The cold itself was an enemy, but it often worked in partnership with damp, smoke, poor nutrition, and the simple reality of too many bodies spending too much time in too small a space. In summer, sickness could be carried out into the open air. In winter, it lingered, circling through the same rooms and the same people until it felt less like an intruder and more like a permanent tenant. The most common complaint was the cold, not just the kind that made you shiver by the fire, but the illness that came from weeks of exposure to low temperatures and stale air. A cough might start in the youngest child and make its way to the eldest grandparent in a matter of days, each person adding their own inflection until the house seemed to have developed its own chorus. What began as sniffles could, in the right conditions, deepen into something far more serious: bronchitis, pneumonia, or the dreaded winter fever, a vague term that could mean almost anything, from influenza to typhus. Without the benefit of germ theory, people blamed such fevers on cold air, bad vapours, or lingering damp, which, given the state of most houses, meant the cause was thought to be everywhere. Frostbite was another hazard, particularly for those tasked with fetching water, tending livestock, or cutting more wood in deep snow. Fingers, toes and ears were the first to suffer, numbing to the point where damage went unnoticed until it was too late. Remedies varied from the sensible, gradual warming by the fire, to the frankly painful, such as rubbing the affected parts with snow or plunging it into cold water to restore the circulation. These last two were often as damaging as the frost itself, but in an age when treatment was more guesswork than science, they were handed down with the same confidence as the most proven cures. Herbal medicine filled the gap where formal care was absent or impractical. Dried herbs hung in the kitchen or stored in small jars were brewed into teas, tinctures, and poultices. Their effects sometimes helpful, sometimes merely hopeful. Chamomile and mint were used to soothe stomachs, willow bark for aches and fevers, and horehound or licorice root for coughs. A strong onion syrup was a popular remedy for congestion, though it made the patients smell as though the illness was emanating from them directly. Mustard plasters applied to the chest or back were another favourite. The heat and irritation they produced considered proof that they were drawing out the sickness. If the illness worsened beyond what herbs and household measures could manage, a doctor might be sent for, though in many areas this meant waiting hours or even days. Winter travel was slow, dangerous, and dependent on whether the weather would allow a horse and rider to get through. A barber surgeon or apothecary might be closer, but their skills were often limited to pulling teeth, setting bones, or providing mixtures whose main effect came from the alcohol they contained. The arrival of a doctor was a mixed blessing. It meant the situation was serious enough to justify the expense and the risk of travel, but it also meant precious time had already been lost. 18th century medicine offered treatments that could be as punishing as the illness itself. Bleeding was a common prescription for fever, the theory being that bad blood could be drawn out and balance restored. This might bring temporary relief to a flushed and feverish patient, but it also weakened them at precisely the moment they needed their strength most. Emetics and purgatives were likewise popular, on the logic that sickness should be driven from the body in any way possible. Many of these cures left the patient exhausted, dehydrated, and no closer to recovery, though they did have the benefit, if it could be called that, of making the patient too tired to complain. For all their faults, these remedies were often delivered with genuine care and the hope of doing good. Families would sit at the patient's bedside, administering spoonfuls of broth or sips of water, wiping foreheads, and speaking in low voices. The effort to keep someone warm was constant, adding more blankets, heating stones to tuck into the bed, and positioning the patient as close to the fire as they could bear. If the illness ran its course and eased, the relief was palpable. If it did not, there was often little to be done, but wait. Isolation in winter made illness more dangerous. A fever in summer might prompt a neighbour to stop by with fresh food, news, or a spare pair of hands. In deep winter, when snow lay heavy on the ground and wind cut through every gap, visits were fewer, and help often came too late. Death in such cases was not necessarily from the severity of the disease itself, but from the slow attrition of being too far from assistance. Even if someone had the will and strength to go for help, the journey could take hours in poor weather, and returning with a doctor might take longer still. Children and the elderly were especially vulnerable. Malnutrition, already a risk by late winter, weakened the immune system, making it easier for an ordinary cold to escalate. Coughs that lingered for weeks could sap the strength of a healthy adult. In a frail body, they could be fatal. Mothers worried constantly over fevers in small children, watching for the moment when flushed cheeks turned to pallor or restless sleep gave way to a frightening stillness. There were no thermometers to provide a reassuring number, only the feel of a hand on a forehead and the hard-won instincts of experience. Not all winter ailments were the work of invisible sickness. The smoke from a constantly burning hearth irritated lungs and eyes, sometimes provoking a cough that was hard to distinguish from more serious illness. Damp bedding or clothing, impossible to fully dry in cold, could aggravate aches and joint pains. The limited diet of the season left some feeling chronically tired, while others suffered from the lingering effects of injuries sustained during daily chores. A slip on the ice or a fall from a ladder while clearing snow could lay someone up for weeks, their immobility breeding further weakness. There was a peculiar stoicism about illness in the colonies. People expected to get sick in winter, and they expected to endure it with little complaint. A persistent cough might be met with a shrug, and the observation that everyone has it this year, while a fever that kept someone in bed for days was accepted as an unpleasant but familiar visitor. Death, while never welcome, was not regarded with the same shock it might provoke today. It was woven into the pattern of life, its possibility always present in the background. Even so, the arrival of illness in the household could shift its entire rhythm. Chores had to be redistributed, meals adjusted, and the patient's comfort managed alongside all the other demands of winter survival. Those tending the sick often grew weary themselves, and it was not uncommon for a caregiver to succumb to the same illness they had been fighting on another's behalf. This could set off a chain reaction that left the entire household struggling. In small communities, such waves of illness could pass from family to family, thinning the available labour and straining everyone's reserves. When recovery came, it was slow. Weeks of coughing could leave a person weak long after the fever was gone, and frostbitten extremities might ache until the weather turned warm again. Some never fully recovered their health, the winter's damage lingering into the next season and making them more susceptible the following year. And for those who did not recover, the funeral was often held quickly, both to prevent the spread of illness, and because the frozen ground made grave digging an arduous task that no one wanted to prolong. Illness might slow the pace of a household, but it rarely stopped it. Winter did not grant sick days to anyone who still had strength enough to stand, and even those recovering from fever or injury were often pressed into light work as soon as they could manage. The cold months might keep you closer to home, but they did not remove the endless list of tasks that kept the household functional. In some ways, winter work was more constant than summer's because it had fewer moments of visible reward. The fields lay dormant, the garden slept under snow, and yet the labour, inside and around the homestead, filled every day with its own demands. You might not be able to plough or plant, but the tools still needed mending, the animals feeding, and the clothing patching. A constant rotation of chores that ensured you went to bed tired long before you were ready for it to be spring. Livestock care was the most unrelenting of these duties. Cows, horses, sheep, pigs and poultry all required daily attention, no matter how hard the wind blew or how deep the snow piled. Barns and sheds offered some shelter, but most were only marginally warmer than the outdoors, and the air inside was heavy with the smell of manure, hay and damp animals. Feeding meant hauling hay or grain, breaking ice in water troughs, and checking for signs of illness or injury among the stock. Bedding had to be replaced or at least rearranged to keep it dry, and stalls mucked out to prevent hoof problems and disease. None of this could be postponed. A hungry or thirsty animal in winter was one step away from sickness or death, and losing livestock in the cold months was more than an inconvenience. It was a setback that could affect the household for years. Indoors, the work took a different shape, but was no less necessary. Clothes worn thin by months of use needed mending before the frayed edges turned into open tears. Stockings were darned, mittens patched, and coats reinforced at elbows and seams. The work was often done in the kitchen by the hearth, hands moving automatically in familiar stitches, while conversation or the sound of the wind filled the gaps. Spinning wool was another winter task, transforming the raw fleece sheared in warmer months into thread for weaving or knitting. The steady rhythm of the wheel, the feel of fibres twisting together, and the faint lanolin scent on your fingers were all signs that, while the world outside lay frozen, the work of the household continued to turn. Tool repair was another occupation that filled the hours between other chores. Axes, scythes, and knives dulled from constant use were sharpened, handles tightened or replaced, and metal parts cleaned of rust. The same was true for cooking utensils. Pots needed their bales secured, wooden spoons sanded smooth, and any ironwork kept oiled against corrosion. In a world where replacing an item often meant making it yourself or waiting months for the next trading opportunity, maintenance was not optional. Every winter spent caring for your tools was an investment in the seasons to come. Food preparation and preservation also had their place in midwinter work. While most preserving had been done in autumn, there were still tasks to be managed. Rendering fat from meat for tallow or lard, brewing small batches of beer or cider from stored apples, or making cheese when milk was available. Leftovers from one meal might be transformed into another, bones simmered into broth, and flour carefully measured for baking days when the oven could be put to use. The kitchen fire was rarely allowed to go out, and tending it became part of the larger cycle of keeping the household both fed and warm. Children were not exempt from the winter workload. While they might be spared the heaviest outdoor chores in the worst weather, they were expected to help indoors with carding wool, winding yarn, shelling dried beans, or assisting in the kitchen. Older children might carry water, feed poultry, or help clean stalls, all under the watchful eye of an adult who understood that idleness in winter could quickly turn into mischief. Education, when it was available, was often done at home during these months, with lessons fitted in around the more pressing needs of the day. The contradiction of winter work was that you were both confined and constantly busy. The cold and snow kept you close to the house and its outbuildings, but the tasks within that narrow world seemed endless. One moment, you might be repairing a broken latch on the barn door, and the next, you were back inside, replating a frayed rope or twisting rushes into new floor coverings. There was no grand sense of accomplishment to most of these jobs, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing they were done, and the certainty that they would need doing again before long. Even leisure was threaded with utility. Quilting bees when they could be arranged were social gatherings as much as they were chances to produce a much-needed blanket. Knitting was done in the evenings while listening to a story or minding a pot on the hearth. Wooden toys might be carved for children not as indulgences, but as practice in keeping the hands busy and the skills sharp. The line between work and pastime was blurred to the point of invisibility, and the measure of a good winter's day was not whether you had rested, but whether you had completed enough small tasks to justify sitting down at all. The weather itself dictated the rhythm of labour. Clear, calm days were used for work that required more time outside, repairing fences, hauling in larger loads of wood, or checking traps set for game. Storm days kept most people indoors, turning attention to those jobs that could be done in the light of the hearth. Even then, the division between indoor and outdoor labour was not absolute. Animals still had to be tended, paths kept clear, and any emergency addressed immediately, regardless of the temperature or the depth of the snow. For all its demands, winter work carried its own kind of security. The routine of feeding animals, mending clothes, and keeping the fire fed offered structure in a season when the days could blur into one another. There was comfort in knowing that the same tasks had been done the winter before and would be done the winter after, by hands not so different from your own. Yet there was also the knowledge that missing even a single chore could carry consequences. Forgetting to bank the fire at night meant a cold start and wasted fuel in the morning. Neglecting to check the barn after a storm could lead to a collapsed roof under the weight of snow. In winter, the margin for error was narrow, and work was as much about preventing disaster as it was about meeting daily needs. The work that never stopped was what kept the household from sliding toward disorder, and in a colonial winter, disorder could be dangerous. A broken tool left unrepaired might fail at the moment it was most needed. A torn coat left unpatched could mean frostbite before the wearer even realised they were in trouble. Even something as mundane as a cluttered walkway could become treacherous when ice and snow made every surface slick. The accumulation of small preventative acts was the invisible scaffold holding up the entire structure of survival. Winter was not a season of idleness, no matter how still the fields lay under snow. It was a season of constant smaller labours, the kind that never filled a larder or built a barn, but without which the larder would empty faster and the barn would not stand another year. These tasks, repetitive and unglamorous, were the threads that held life together through the long cold months. By the time the days began to lengthen, the evidence of this work would be everywhere. Clothes that were patched but still serviceable, tools sharpened and ready, animals alive and in fair condition, and a household that had endured another winter's worth of demands without collapsing under their weight. Much of the work that filled a colonial winter depended on every able set of hands, which meant children were not idle observers. The tasks may have been smaller or lighter than those given to adults, but they were part of the same daily rhythm that kept the household functioning. The long, cold months shaped their days as surely as they shaped the grown-ups, and though there was room for play, it often took its place in the gaps between chores rather than in place of them. Winter was a season when the younger members of the family learned the fine balance between work, amusement, and the unspoken rule that idleness was suspicious at best and sinful at worst. For many children, the winter months brought a pause or complete break in formal schooling. In rural areas, the journey to a schoolhouse was often impractical once snow began to pile up, and the cold made unheated buildings difficult to endure for hours at a time. Some continued lessons at home, if parents or older siblings could spare the time to teach them. But for others, the change meant a shift to purely practical education. Instead of reading primers and copying sums, they learned by doing, helping to prepare meals, assisting with sewing or mending, and accompanying older family members on trips to fetch water, firewood, or supplies. These tasks were not considered distractions from education, but its winter form. Learning to run a household was as valued as any book learning, and for many, it was the more immediately useful skill set. Indoors, the work children were given reflected their size and ability. Younger ones might wind yarn from skeins, cardwool, or sort dried beans for cooking. Slightly older children could be trusted to tend a small fire, watch a pot on the hearth, or keep younger siblings occupied while the adults worked. Carrying messages between nearby households was another common winter duty, since a child on foot could travel narrow paths faster than an adult hauling a sled or load. Even these smaller responsibilities were framed as essential contributions, the idea being that everyone in the household had their part in the greater work of survival. Play still found its way into the day, but it often had to be carefully woven around necessity. In a season when daylight was short and chores plentiful, games were sometimes fitted into the margins of the work, a quick competition to see who could shell the most peas, or a pretend market set up with scraps of cloth and leftover bits of yarn. Board games and card games, when available, were played in the evenings by the hearth, though anything involving paper or wooden pieces was handled with care. Toys were not easily replaced if broken. Improvised games were more common, riddles, storytelling, and memory challenges that could be played without props. Outdoors, when the weather allowed, children made their own amusements in the snow. Sledding, snowball fights, and building forts were common pastimes, as was sliding on frozen ponds. Skates, when they existed at all, were often homemade, simple wooden runners strapped to boots. Even these activities had their practical limits. Children were expected to avoid getting dangerously wet or tired, knowing that returning home chilled could mean illness. In particularly deep snow, older children might be sent out to tramp paths between the house and the outbuildings, their play doubling as maintenance for the routes needed to carry out daily chores. The notion that idleness was a sin shaped the way leisure was perceived. Games and amusements were encouraged only if they could be reframed as useful. Knitting or sewing could be social, as well as productive, with a group gathered to work and talk together. Whittling could yield a toy or a tool handle. Even storytelling was sometimes presented as a form of instruction, with tales chosen for the moral lesson they carried. Children quickly learned to couch their entertainment in practical terms, if only to avoid being assigned a less pleasant task in place of it. The physical constraints of winter influenced behaviour too. With everyone spending so much time indoors, noise and clutter became irritants. Children were expected to keep their things in order, to avoid running or shouting indoors, and to respect the space needed for adults' work. In a crowded house, this could be a challenge, especially when younger children's energy outpaced the day's tasks. Patience was as much a survival skill as the ability to knit a pair of mittens, and learning to entertain oneself quietly was considered a sign of maturity. Winter was also a time when children observed the subtler rhythms of the household. They saw how food was rationed, how fuel was managed, and how sickness was tended to. Lessons that would shape their own decision-making in adulthood. Participation in these processes was part of their preparation for the day when they would be responsible for their own homes. In this way, the chores given to them were less about immediate necessity and more about passing on the knowledge of how to manage through scarcity and hardship. For children in households with livestock, animal care was often part of the winter routine. Feeding chickens, collecting eggs when they could be found, and making sure smaller animals had unfrozen water were tasks within their ability. These jobs came with their own hazards in cold weather, slipping on ice, dealing with an ill-tempered animal, or simply enduring the chill, and so were both a test of responsibility and a reminder of the physical demands of the season. Older children might assist in heavier work, such as carrying hay bales or helping to clean stalls, gaining strength along with experience. The relationship between children and the season was not entirely one of burden. Winter also offered moments of freedom from the more rigid schedule of warmer months, without the demands of planting, weeding and harvesting. The pace of the day could be looser, allowing for more time together indoors. Families often gathered in the evenings, with children listening to adult conversation, songs or readings from whatever books were at hand. These gatherings were as much a part of a child's education as any formal lesson, exposing them to stories, news, and the slow exchange of ideas that travelled from household to household. Still, the expectation of productivity never vanished entirely. If a child seemed to have too much time on their hands, an adult would find a way to fill it, winding skeins, sorting seeds for spring, mending a small tear in a garment, or scraping a hide. The line between a task and a punishment was thin, and a poorly disguised game might quickly be redirected into something with tangible results. This constant push toward usefulness shaped children into contributors, sometimes at the expense of the pure leisure that modern childhood assumes. The balance between work and play in a colonial winter was not always easy, but it was seen as essential. Children were not simply biding their time until spring. They were learning the skills, habits, and endurance that would be required of them for the rest of their lives. The games they played, the chores they performed, and the way they navigated the crowded, chilly confines of a winter household were all part of an education that was as practical as it was unspoken. In this way, winter was both a challenge and a teacher, shaping not just how children passed the season, but who they would become when it was their turn to keep the household through the long, cold months. The rhythm of a household in winter was largely self-contained, but no home existed entirely on its own. Families might spend much of their time within the narrow orbit of their own hearth, yet winter had a way of reminding people that survival was often a shared project. For children, this meant hearing adult conversations about neighbours who had been seen hauling extra firewood, who had slaughtered an animal early, who was rumoured to be running low on grain. For adults, it meant weighing the balance between privacy and connection, because winter could both draw communities closer and magnify the distances between them. Travel in winter was slow, deliberate, and often dictated by necessity. Roads that were rutted dirt in summer became frozen ridges of ice and snow, passable only by sled, snowshoes, or on foot. The decision to visit a neighbour was rarely spontaneous. It required preparation, daylight, and a fair certainty that the weather would hold long enough for the return trip. Church services were often the most regular point of contact for settlers during the cold months, a weekly reason to harness the horses, bundle the children, and brave the wind for the sake of seeing more than the faces at one's own table. The journey itself could be as memorable as the service, with neighbours encountered along the way and greetings shouted across the frozen air. Church gatherings were as much social events as religious obligations. News was exchanged in hurried conversations outside before everyone hurried in from the cold, and the warmth of the crowded room was as welcome as the sermon. After the service, there might be an unspoken competition to linger as long as possible before heading back into the wind. For many, this was the only regular opportunity to speak with friends and acquaintances beyond their immediate family, and even brief exchanges helped to ward off the creeping sense of isolation that could come from long stretches indoors. Other communal gatherings were more deliberately arranged. Quilting bees were a popular winter pastime in settlements, where neighbours lived close enough to make the trip. These events served a dual purpose: the production of a much-needed household item and the opportunity for conversation. The combined warmth of the participants, the hiss of the fire, and the steady rhythm of needles moving through fabric created an atmosphere where news and gossip could be shared freely. Stories of distant relatives, weather predictions, and the occasional political opinion all found their way into the hum of talk around the quilt frame. Shared meals were another way winter communities came together. When supplies allowed, households might host a dinner for neighbours, pooling resources so that the table offered more variety than any one family could manage alone. These gatherings often featured foods saved for special occasions: a roast from an animal slaughtered that week, a pie made from carefully stored fruit, bread baked with the last of the fine flour. Such meals were not simply about indulgence, they reinforced bonds between families, created obligations of reciprocity, and offered a reminder that not every day had to be as austere as February's diet usually demanded. Winter gatherings also had a practical side. Barn raisings and other large-scale communal tasks were more common in warmer weather, but some kinds of work could be tackled in the cold months. Sleds might be used to haul logs for a neighbour's building project, or groups might work together to clear a road blocked by fallen trees or heavy snow. The willingness to lend a hand when needed was more than courtesy. It was a kind of mutual insurance. Everyone knew that the day could come when they would be the ones needing help, and those debts, unspoken though they might be, were remembered. Yet the same closeness that fostered cooperation could also trap people in the company of those they would rather avoid. In a small community, feuds and grievances had nowhere to dissipate in winter. Neighbours who had argued over a fence line in summer might find themselves sitting across from each other at a quilting bee or pressed shoulder to shoulder in a church pew. The season offered little opportunity to ignore one another, and tensions could simmer under the surface of even the most civil conversation. Sometimes winter's enforced proximity led to reconciliation. Other times, it simply preserved the quarrel until spring gave space for it to grow again. The weather itself often decided the shape of community life. A stretch of clear days might bring a flurry of visits, errands, and gatherings as people took advantage of the easier travel. A sudden storm could cut off contact for weeks, leaving families to rely on whatever supplies and company they already had at home. Messages might be sent via the hardiest members of the settlement, often young men on snowshoes or children sent with written notes. But these were reserved for important news rather than casual updates. Seasonal celebrations were sometimes adjusted to fit the realities of winter travel. Weddings were less common in the coldest months, though they did occur, especially if the union was urgent for practical or familial reasons. Christenings and funerals were more frequent, the latter often requiring the combined effort of neighbours to dig a grave in frozen ground. In such cases, the community came together not just out of habit, but out of necessity, pooling labour and resources to ensure the work was done. Winter hospitality carried its own customs. Visitors were expected to be offered warmth, food and drink upon arrival, even if the household could spare little. Refusing these courtesies was considered rude, and accepting them was part of the ritual of connection. Guests often brought small contributions, a jar of preserves, a length of cloth, or a bundle of kindling, as a sign of appreciation. Conversations tended to stretch longer than in warmer months, partly because departures meant facing the cold again, and partly because company was a rare luxury. Children played their part in community life as well. Visits to neighbours were chances to see other young faces, to share games, and to compare how other households managed their winter routines. They might return home with new songs, new rules for familiar games, or stories of animals, people, or weather from beyond their own yard. These small exchanges enriched the rhythm of life, breaking the monotony in ways as valuable as any new tool or recipe. Community in the cold was sustained by a combination of obligation, necessity, and genuine human desire for connection. It was a careful balance, maintained by those willing to brave the weather for the sake of a few hours in another's company. The warmth of these gatherings lingered in memory long after the fire had burned down, serving as proof that even in the harshest months, life was more than just endurance. But it was also a reminder that relationships, friendly or otherwise, were as much a part of survival as any store of food or stack of firewood, and managing them was its own kind of winter labour. The networks of community that sustained colonial life in winter did not end with the boundaries of a settlement. Beyond the cluster of houses, barns and fields lay a far older network of knowledge, one that had been surviving northern winters for countless generations before a single European settler set foot on the continent. For all their pride in old world resourcefulness, colonial families often found that their imported habits were poorly matched to the reality of the New World winter. The climate could be harsher, the snow deeper, and the cold more sustained than what most had known before. Over time, necessity forced them to notice what their indigenous neighbours were doing, and when hunger, frost, or sheer common sense prevailed, to adopt those practices, though rarely without claiming the credit for themselves. At first, many settlers resisted these lessons. European traditions had centuries of prestige behind them, and there was a certain reluctance to admit that anything so uncivilized could offer improvement. Thick leather shoes, for instance, seemed perfectly adequate in the cobbled streets of London or the frost-touched fields of the Low Countries. But they were less useful when trudging through drifts that could swallow a person up to the knee. It was in such conditions that snowshoes became more than a curiosity. Indigenous peoples across the northern woodlands had long relied on them to spread a person's weight across the snow, allowing for steady travel over terrain that would otherwise be exhausting. Some colonial families traded for them directly, while others attempted to copy their design. In either case, the first awkward steps often gave way to the recognition that without them, certain journeys would be impossible. Clothing offered another lesson in adaptation. Wool and linen could only do so much against sustained cold, and the addition of fur-lined garments proved invaluable. Indigenous methods of boot insulation, stuffing them with dried grasses, moss, or fur to trap heat, spread quietly among settlers, though many preferred to present the idea as something they had devised after careful observation of nature. Likewise, the layered use of hides over woolen undergarments, a common indigenous practice, helped protect against wind and wet in a way that European tailored coats could not always match. Some settlers even adopted the use of mittens made from animal hide with the fur turned inward, finding them warmer and more durable than their knitted equivalents. Food, too, was an area where the indigenous winter knowledge proved essential. The colonial pantry was built around preserved meat, grain, and a few hardy vegetables, but these alone could not always sustain health through the long, cold months. Indigenous diets incorporated a broader range of preserved foods, including dried berries, nuts, and fish, all valuable sources of nutrients that could stave off illness. The practice of drying meat into lightweight, long-lasting strips, often with added fat to make pemmican, offered an energy-dense food that was both portable and slow to spoil. Colonists who had suffered through lean winters learned to value such supplies, though few openly acknowledged where the idea had come from. Hunting and trapping techniques were another area of exchange. While European settlers brought their own methods for catching game, they often found them less effective in deep snow or remote forest. Indigenous traps and snares designed with local species and seasonal behaviour in mind offered higher yields with less effort. The knowledge of how to track animals across snow, read signs in the forest, and identify good trapping spots was something that could not be picked up from a book. Some settlers learned through formal trade agreements or alliances. Others acquired it more informally, through observation and quiet questions posed to those willing to answer. Travel in winter also improved under indigenous influence. Sleds and toboggans, designed to glide over snow without sinking, made it possible to transport heavier loads with less effort than dragging them on foot. Settlers adapted these designs to their own needs, building them from available wood and sometimes incorporating metal runners when they could be spared. This allowed for the movement of supplies, firewood, and even the sick or injured over distances that would have been nearly impossible otherwise. Again, the origin of these designs was often downplayed in colonial accounts, which tended to frame them as ingenious improvements rather than borrowed wisdom. Even in the matter of shelter, indigenous practices left their mark. While most settlers remained committed to their wooden houses, they learned techniques for better insulation, such as banking snow against outer walls, to reduce wind penetration, a method long used in indigenous winter camps. In more remote areas, some settlers temporarily adopted semi-nomadic winter structures, using portable frames and hides to create shelters closer to hunting grounds or timber stands. Such arrangements puzzled Europeans who associated permanence with progress, but the logic of moving closer to resources in winter was difficult to dispute once it had been experienced. Relationships between settlers and indigenous communities in winter could be complex. Trade might be cordial, with both sides benefiting from the exchange of goods and knowledge, or it could be strained by competition for resources. Still, the urgency of survival often softened boundaries that politics or prejudice tried to enforce. A settler who might speak dismissively of savages in summer could by January be relying on their snowshoes, eating their style of preserved meat, and wearing boots patterned after theirs. These contradictions were rarely acknowledged, but they ran through much of colonial winter life. Reluctance to credit indigenous sources was partly rooted in pride and partly in the written culture of the time. Many colonial accounts were intended for audiences back in Europe, where tales of self-reliance and the taming of a wild land were more appealing than admissions of dependence on those who had lived there for centuries. As a result, many of the practical adaptations that kept settlers alive entered the record as anonymous local customs or ingenious solutions without mention of the people who had perfected them over generations. Yet despite this, the influence remained visible in daily life. A winter traveller in the colonies might pass a family making their way across a frozen field on snowshoes, a sled loaded with firewood trailing behind, the father's boots lined with fur and the mother's hood cut in a style more common among their indigenous neighbours than in London or Amsterdam. They might be carrying a pouch of dried berries for the journey, or storing their firewood in a way that mirrored the practices of nearby communities. In these details, the quiet story of adaptation was written, one that could not be erased simply by omitting its source from the ledger. Adapting to the New World's winter, whether by stubborn trial or borrowed wisdom, did not mean mastering it. Even the best prepared colonial household lived under the quiet knowledge that the season could still deliver a week or a single night, capable of unravelling months of careful planning. Winter was never a uniform hardship. It was a series of steady, predictable burdens, punctuated by sudden calamities that tested every reserve of food, fuel and nerve. To live through the season was to live with the awareness that the next disaster might already be on its way, hidden beyond the line of the trees or gathering in the sky. Blizzards were among the most feared events, their danger lying not just in the snow, but in the speed with which they arrived. A clear morning could sour into a white wall of wind and ice within hours, erasing paths, fences, and even familiar landmarks. For settlers caught away from home, disorientation could be fatal. Stories circulated of men found only yards from their own doors, frozen after wandering in circles. Inside the house, the sound of the wind battering the walls and the snow hissing against the roof could make even a seasoned settler uneasy. Blizzards trapped families indoors for days, forcing them to ration fuel and food more strictly, while the drifts piled higher and the world beyond the windows disappeared entirely. Ice storms carried a different sort of menace. They arrived less dramatically than blizzards, often as a steady rain that seemed merely inconvenient until the temperature dropped, and everything was sheathed in glass. Branches snapped under the weight, fences bowed, and roofs groaned. Paths became treacherous, and even short trips to the barn or well became careful negotiations with the frozen ground. Livestock suffered badly in such conditions, their shelters straining under the accumulation and their water supplies sealing over almost as quickly as they could be cleared. An ice storm could take days to loosen its grip, leaving behind a landscape that was deceptively beautiful, glittering in the sun, but dangerous to cross and destructive in its wake. Fire was another winter disaster, and one that was all the more cruel for striking at the very heart of survival. The hearth was the household's lifeline, but it was also a constant hazard. A neglected chimney, thick with soot and creosote, could ignite suddenly, turning the flue into a roaring column of flame. With no organised fire brigades, the only defence was a bucket line, assuming water could be fetched quickly enough in freezing weather, or smothering the blaze with wet blankets if it could be reached. The danger was not limited to chimneys. A tipped candle, an ember spat from the fire onto a rag rug, or an overturned oil lamp could reduce a house to cinders in minutes. And in the middle of winter, the loss of shelter meant far more than homelessness. It meant exposure, with little chance of survival, unless neighbours could take the family in immediately. Even without such dramatic events, disaster could creep in more quietly. A warm spell followed by a hard freeze could collapse the snow-banked walls of a livestock shelter, letting wind and cold in overnight. A sudden illness could incapacitate the person responsible for tending the fire or caring for the animals, allowing cold or hunger to take hold before others could adjust. A broken tool at the wrong moment, an axe head flying from its handle, a sled runner splitting under load, could delay essential work long enough for damage to set in. These were not the kinds of events that made it into grand tales, but they were the ones most likely to weaken a household's ability to endure. Starvation winters were the sum of such misfortunes, compounded by bad luck in hunting or poor harvests the year before. In these seasons, every snowfall felt heavier, every cold snap sharper, because each one narrowed the margin for survival. Families cut rations to the minimum, stretching a pot of thin soup over multiple meals, or grinding whatever grain they had left into coarse flour for bread that was more filler than nourishment. Meat became a rare luxury, and the absence of fresh food left people more susceptible to illness. The psychological weight of constant hunger was as wearing as the physical weakness it caused, and in some communities, people later remembered such years more vividly than wars or storms. Livestock losses during such winters could be as devastating as human hardship. Animals were wealth in themselves, milk, meat, labour, and losing them meant not just immediate deprivation, but a blow to the next season's prospects. A horse lost to cold or injury meant heavier burdens on the people who relied on it for transport and field work. Cows that failed to survive the winter could not provide milk for the family or calves for sale. Even poultry, small as they were, represented eggs and meat that could not easily be replaced until the warmer months. Settlers learned to guard their animals as fiercely as their food stores, but storms, illness, and predators took their toll regardless. In the face of such hazards, grim humour was one of the few defences available. Settlers swapped stories of neighbours whose blizzards had misplaced their barns or whose chimney fires had been put out, only when the roof collapsed on them. Tales told with a mix of sympathy and the wry recognition that it could easily have been one's own turn. Jokes about stews so thin it needed a lifeline to find the meat, or about sheep so cold their wool grew icicles, were ways of lightening the weight of worry. No one mistook this humour for optimism, but it allowed for a kind of camaraderie, the shared acknowledgement that winter's trials were absurd as well as cruel. The memory of disasters lingered long after the snow melted. A barn rebuilt in spring still carried the story of the storm that flattened it. A family that had lost livestock might speak in hushed tones of the bad year for decades. Preparations, in the autumn often reflected these memories, with households taking extra care to clean chimneys, reinforce roofs, and store more food than they thought strictly necessary. The idea was not that one could prevent disaster entirely, but that one could blunt its edge when it inevitably came. Winter disasters also had a way of knitting communities together, however reluctantly. A house fire might bring neighbours running with blankets and tools. A blizzard could lead to shared meals when one family's stores were cut off from replenishment, and the loss of livestock might prompt offers of breeding animals in spring. These acts of mutual aid were partly born of compassion and partly of the practical knowledge that next time the roles might be reversed. In this sense, even the worst weeks of winter reinforced the delicate network of cooperation that underpinned survival. Yet for all the resilience such experiences fostered, there was no denying that disasters could break people. A family that entered winter already worn down by illness, debt, or loss could find themselves unable to recover from a single hard blow. Abandonment of farms, migration to less hostile regions, or absorption into other households were common outcomes in the aftermath of a particularly bad season. The line between perseverance and surrender was as thin as the ice on a thawing pond, and once crossed, it was rarely retraced. Surviving winter's disasters did not mean the ordeal was over. The season rarely ended with a neat turning of the calendar, nor with a triumphant declaration that the cold had been beaten. Instead, it yielded grudgingly, breaking apart in fits and starts until, almost without noticing, you found yourself standing ankle deep in meltwater, squinting at bare ground you had not seen in months. The first thaw was a moment of relief, but also a warning. The work was not finished, and the new season came with its own set of hazards, some of them as immediate as the blizzard you had just escaped. The earliest sign of change was often sound rather than sight. Icicles began to drip in the afternoon sun, a slow, persistent tapping that continued until night froze them again. Roofs shed their loads of snow in sudden, shuddering slides that could startle anyone standing too close. The snow itself lost its crisp crunch underfoot, turning to a wet, heavy mass that clung to boots and sled runners. Paths that had been firm and clear in the cold began to soften at the edges, and what had been easy travel one day became a slogging trudge the next. For all its promise, the thaw quickly reminded people that it was not a clean break from winter, but an awkward, often unpleasant transition. Mud was the season's constant companion. The same routes that had been smoothed by packed snow turned into deep, sucking tracks of half-frozen muck. Horses strained against their harnesses, wagons tilted dangerously, and anyone travelling on foot risked losing a boot to the pull of the earth. The yards between houses and barns became small quagmires, and any attempt to keep floors clean inside was largely symbolic. Children were scolded for tracking mud in, but adults were no better at avoiding it. The smell of wet earth mixed with another, less welcome scent, the thaw revealing what the snow had hidden. Under the melting drifts lay the remains of animals that had not survived the winter. Some were livestock lost to illness or cold, others wild creatures that had starved or frozen, their bodies preserved until the thaw exposed them. The sight was unpleasant, the smell worse, and disposing of them became an urgent chore. Even smaller debris emerged, broken tools left out too long, buckets lost in a snowstorm, scraps of fabric or leather from garments discarded in mid-season. The thaw was as much an unearthing as a renewal, a reminder of winter's toll in tangible form. Water brought its own troubles. Snowmelt swelled streams and rivers, sometimes turning them into rushing, unpredictable hazards. Bridges could be swept away, and low-lying fields or homes were at risk of flooding. In some years, the water seeped into cellars, spoiling what remained of stored food or damaging the foundations of buildings. Settlers scrambled to dig channels to divert the flow, but the sheer volume of meltwater often overpowered their efforts. A sudden warm spell could set off a rapid thaw, increasing the risk of flooding before the ground had time to absorb the moisture. Inside the house, the thaw brought a shift in the daily rhythm. Fires still burned, but less constantly, as the warmer days made the interiors stifling if the hearth was overfed. Bedding was aired out when the weather allowed, and windows cracked open to release the heavy smell of smoke and close air that had built up over the long months. Clothing, too, began to change. Layers were shed, woolen mittens and scarves stored away, and lighter garments brought back into use. The temptation to put away all the trappings of winter was strong, but those with more experience knew better. A late snow was not just possible, but likely. The most welcome change came to the table. The first edible greens of spring, dandelion leaves, wild onion, and other early shoots, appeared like small miracles, adding fresh flavour and variety after months of salted meat and stored vegetables. These first harvests were modest, gathered in baskets during brief forays into the warming fields and woods, but they signalled the return of variety to the diet. Milk from cows that had calved began to flow again, and eggs became more plentiful as poultry responded to the lengthening days. Meals grew a little more generous, though still far from abundant, and the psychological lift was almost as valuable as the physical nourishment. Work outside the home resumed in earnest, almost as soon as the ground allowed. Fences damaged by snow or fallen trees needed repair. Tools were brought out for spring planting, and the first ploughing began as soon as the soil could be turned. This work carried its own urgency. Every day lost to preparation was a day stolen from the growing season. The thaw also revealed the full extent of any winter damage, roofs needing patching, chimneys needing repair, or barns in need of reinforcement before the next storm season. The relief of surviving the winter was quickly tempered by the realization that the next one was already on the distant horizon, and preparations for it would begin almost immediately. The thaw also tested the community's ability to work together. Flooded roads and damaged bridges affected everyone, and shared labour was often the fastest way to restore them. Neighbours helped one another move stranded livestock to higher ground or salvage belongings from waterlogged cellars. These moments could strengthen bonds forged over the winter, but they could also renew tensions, particularly if resources were scarce or if old disagreements resurfaced over how repairs should be done. For all its mess and inconvenience, the first thaw brought a kind of energy absent from the heart of winter. The longer days and milder air encouraged people outdoors, even if only to stand in the yard and feel the sun on their faces. Children found new amusements in the running water and soft earth, despite the inevitable muddy clothes that followed. The sounds of birds returning mixed with the rush of meltwater and the creak of wagons venturing out for the first time in months. It was the season's way of reminding everyone that the world was not frozen forever. Yet the thaw's optimism was cautious. A frost could still strike in late spring, undoing the first green shoots in the garden. A sudden storm could bring snow heavy enough to break branches and delay planting. The lessons of the winter just past were still fresh, and settlers carried them forward. Store more wood, check the chimney earlier, plant a wider variety of crops, reinforce the barn roof. The thaw was not an escape from hardship, but a pivot to its next form, and those who survived understood that better than most. In the end, the first thaw was both an ending and a beginning. It marked the close of one struggle and the start of another. the muddy, damp bridge between enduring and rebuilding. The relief it brought was genuine, a loosening of the shoulders, a breath that didn't frost in the air, but it was laced with the knowledge that the cycle would come around again. In just a few short months, the woodpile would need rebuilding, the larder filling, and the mine turning once more toward the long cold shadow that would eventually fall again. And that brings us to the end of our long trudge through the colonial winter, a season of salted meat, frozen wells, and the faint hope that the roof might survive one more storm. Feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a comment with another forgotten corner of history you'd like explored next. If you'd like early access to more of these quiet descents into forgotten history, ad-free audio of the episodes, or just want to support the show, there's a link to the Patreon in the description. If you're listening on a podcast app, a rating or review helps more people find their way to these stories. And special thanks to the supporters who make this show possible, including our chroniclers Andrew S. and Rich Davis. Sleep well.